Well, thank you so much for that introduction. You can all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. It's an honor to be here, and it's a super honor. I've never had 3 mics put on my body before. This is pretty amazing. Talk about high tech. So I am going to be talking about, as we were talking, about a diary written by a Norwegian who you probably have never heard of, a man named Odd Nansen, and a diary that he kept while he was a prisoner in different concentration camps during World War II, that he published after the war under the title Fra Dag til Dag, from day to day. Now what I'd like to do is to begin with a story. And I'd like you not just to sit there and listen to this story as if I'm relating the experience of somebody else. I'd like you to almost try to project yourself into the story as if I'm talking about your own experience, okay? So in order to do that, you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit. First of all, I'd like you to all imagine that you are once again a 10-year-old child. From the look of this crowd, that should be the easiest thing. You look like you're in your, 20s, pushing 30s maybe? Second of all, I'd like you to imagine that instead of, that the date is not late July 2026, but rather it's late January 1945. And third, I'd like you to imagine, this is probably the hardest thing, is to imagine instead of waking up in a nice soft bed in a nice comfortable house in Poolesville, Maryland, imagine you find yourself waking up in a concentration camp. And not just any concentration camp, a camp called Auschwitz. I think you're all familiar with that name, right? And the guards have just come into your barracks, and they're screaming and shouting and bellowing the command, Raus! Raus. If you know German, you know that Raus means out. Everybody out. We're evacuating the whole camp. So you line up outside your barracks, you join this marching column that is already miles long, make your way through the front gate onto these back roads, and you're going to walk through the snow and ice and mud and slush in bitterly, bitterly cold temperatures. Remember, it's January 1945, for the next 3 days, at which point you reach a rail junction, and you're put on a train, but a train that consists only of cattle cars. Cattle cars, of course, have 4 sides. They have no roof. They have no heat. They have no protection from the elements. And you're going to spend the next 10 days in that cattle car as this train slowly makes its way out of southwestern Poland, which is Auschwitz is located, takes a long southerly detour through Czechoslovakia, and finally turns north into Germany and comes to a stop at yet another concentration camp, this one called Sachsenhausen. And when you get to Sachsenhausen, you're grateful that you're still even alive. Thousands of people died in just that 2-week period. In fact, 1 out of every 4 prisoners who left Auschwitz in late January 1945 never made it to their final destination alive. But you're one of the fortunate ones. You're one of the lucky ones who actually made it alive. But that doesn't mean that you're not suffering by this point. It doesn't mean you're not hurting. In fact, by the time you get to Sachsenhausen, you've got such terrific pains in both your feet that you can barely walk into the camp under your own power. But up until now, on this 2-week odyssey that you've been involved in, you dare not take off your boots to see what the source of this pain is, probably for a variety of reasons, but certainly one of them is the fear that if you take off your boots, somebody who's bigger and stronger than you is going to steal them. Remember, you're only a 10-year-old child, and by January 1945, the world is a jungle. It's survival of the fittest. People are prepared to literally do just about anything to try to stay alive. That means stealing from a 10-year-old child. They're going to do it. So now that you've finally made it into Sachsenhausen, you have a chance now to take off your boots to see what the source of this pain that's growing ever stronger each day, see what's going on with your feet. And you look at your feet, and they no longer look like the palm of my hand. Your feet have turned completely black from frostbite. So severe that the flesh on your toes is already beginning to rot. So you know you have to go to the infirmary. The German word for the infirmary was the WWII. You know that, because I think you would agree with me, that's the logical thing to do, right? I mean, if you're hurt, you're injured, you need to get medical attention. That's what I do. If I get sick or get injured, I get medical attention to get better. But in the crazy, illogical world of a concentration camp, the WWII, the infirmary, was actually considered one of the most dangerous places you could go. The prisoners called it the waiting room for the gas chamber. Because if you think about it, if you're lying in a bed, you're not working. And if you're not working, you're just a useless mouth. You're not contributing to the camp. You're just using up resources. But you also know, even though you're only a 10-year-old child, you have enough wisdom to know that even if you could withstand this pain that's getting ever worse, even if you could put up with that, if you don't get some medical attention, you're undoubtedly going to get gangrene in your legs or you're going to get sepsis, either of which is going to end up killing you. So you screw up your courage, you report to the infirmary. Luckily for you, there's a kindly doctor on duty that day, not a Nazi doctor. He's a fellow prisoner. He takes one look at your feet. He asks you to climb up on an examining table like this so he can get a better look at your feet. With that, he makes a motion to a couple of orderlies. They come alongside you, and when he gives the order, they hold down your arms, they hold down your legs. He gives you a whiff of ether, knocks you unconscious. And the next thing you remember is slowly coming back to consciousness. You look around, you realize you're lying in a bed now in the infirmary. You look down at your feet, you see that they're both heavily bandaged. And the orderlies in that hospital ward explained to you that the doctor had to amputate some of your toes in order to save your feet from further infection. So here you are lying in this bed wondering to yourself, well, how long am I going to be allowed to use this bed? What happens if a Nazi doctor sees me, a 10-year-old child using up a bed? What's going to happen to me then? In the meantime, hundreds, if not thousands of prisoners are streaming through the infirmary, the Revier, at all hours of the day and night. By the spring of 1945, Sachsenhausen had a prisoner population somewhere between 35 and 40,000 prisoners, the size of almost a small city. And these prisoners who are coming through the infirmary have at least one thing in common, which is they're not paying the slightest bit of attention to you. I mean, they don't know who you are. You're not from their village. You're not a member of their extended family. You're not related to them. So why should they care about you? I mean, the most important rule in the camp is you look out for number one. You look out for yourself. You don't worry about anybody else, least of all people who are complete strangers. And then one day, a middle-aged man comes into the infirmary. He's coming in to visit one of his friends who is sick. And instead of walking right by your bed and ignoring you like everybody else has up to that point, he stops, starts talking to you, starts asking you questions. Child, what's your name? Where did you come from? What camp were you in before you arrived here in Sachsenhausen? Do you know where your parents are? Do you have any family here in this camp at all? Any friends? In other words, this one human being is showing some interest in you and in your plight. So why am I telling you this elaborate story in the first place? For a couple of reasons. The first reason is everything I just told you is a true story. The young child I've just been describing was a boy named Thomas Bergenthal. That's a picture of Tommy taken in 1938. He's all of 4 years old in that photograph. Okay, he was born in 1934. The man who stopped to talk to him was a Norwegian named Odd Nansen. And that's a picture of Nansen taken roughly around the time he was arrested. He was a middle-aged man at the time he was arrested. Now, the second reason why I'm telling you this story is that chance meeting, that chance encounter between these two people ended up changing both of their lives. In Tommy's case, it literally meant the difference between life and death, between living and dying. Because from that day forward, Nansen used his food and tobacco rations to bribe the orderlies to look out for Tommy, to protect him, to make sure his name never showed up on the selection list of prisoners who were being sent off to the gas chamber to, quote unquote, make room for more sick prisoners. Now, I said a few minutes ago that this meeting changed both their lives. If you think about it, at least kind of quickly or superficially, you wonder to yourself, well, what can a 10-year-old boy, what can he possibly do to help a grown man like Nansen? Oh, I should stop there for a second, because I skipped over something. You're probably wondering, well, how did Nansen have enough food and tobacco that he could be giving it away in the form of bribes to these orderlies? I mean, I thought everybody in these camps was starving. You know, every picture you see of a concentration camp prisoner, it's always these emaciated skeletal bodies. How can Nansen have gotten away with this? Well, that's not a completely accurate picture of what life in these large concentration camps was like. Turns out they were very stratified societies, stratified on the basis of race. Because the Nazis, after all, were fascinated, were obsessed with this whole concept of race. You know, they believed in what they called their Weltanschauung, which means their worldview, that they belonged to the Aryan race. And the Aryan race were the Hedenvolk, the master race that was destined to rule all over conquered Europe. At the bottom of that totem pole, of course, the Nazis put the Jews, who they considered to be racially Untermenschen, subhuman, fit for nothing other than slave labor and ultimate extermination. But the Nazis had to find a place in this pecking order for they'd call it race, we would call them nationalities. But they thought almost every nationality had its own unique racial characteristics. And the Nazis looked at the Scandinavian prisoners, both the Norwegians and the Danes, and they said, in many ways, you are racially akin to us. You're like almost like our first cousins, racially speaking. I mean, after all, you're tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. You could pass for Aryan, except for the fact that you don't have a Germanic background. So if we Aryans are the top of the pile, you Nordics, which is what they call the Scandinavians, are really just kind of like one notch below us. And certainly we consider you to be racially superior to the French, the Greeks, the Romanians, the Poles, etc. And by virtue of the fact that they held the Scandinavians in such high esteem, they allowed them in these concentration camps one benefit they didn't allow to anybody else. And that is they allowed them to receive food parcels from the Red Cross. And if you've got food in a camp where everybody else is starving, you are rich. You can get anything you want. I mean, you can barter away that food for anything, better clothing, better jobs, whatever you needed. If you've got the coin of the realm is food. That's what distinguished them. So Nansen, just by virtue of the fact that he was Norwegian, was able to do something that very few people could have done because he was getting a regular supply of these food parcels. Now, I said, as I mentioned, that this changed both their lives. It's hard to imagine what a 10-year-old child can possibly do to help a grown man like Nansen, who's been getting, since he's been getting these food parcels, he's actually in physically better shape than 99% of all the prisoners there. Well, I think there's nothing that Tommy could do physically to help Nansen, but I think if you read Nansen's diary, I think you have to come to the conclusion that by the spring of 1945, which is when they meet, late January, early February 1945, that Nansen was heading for a mental breakdown. You know, by this time he has been in prison for 3.5 years. He's seen every kind of cruelty, every kind of barbarity you can imagine. And every time he thinks to himself, well, at least we've hit rock bottom. Things can't get any worse. Guess what? They always got even worse. And this is what Nansen wrote about his meeting with Tommy. This is not in his diary. This is in a book that he wrote after the war, but he writes, "Everywhere I went in the camp, Tommy's angelic face popped up. Without suspecting it, Tommy accomplished with us a work of salvation. He touched something in us which was about to disappear. He called to life again human feelings, which were painful to have, but which nevertheless meant salvation for us all." So you can see where just getting involved with Tommy, I think, kind of gave Nansen that additional impetus just to keep going through those final agonizing months of the war. Now, the third reason why I'm telling you this story is that meeting between these two people ended up changing my life as well. Now, I think you can see that I'm not old enough to have even been alive during World War II, and it would take 60 years for that event to intersect with my life. And the one thing that was left out of the introduction was my daytime job was as a lawyer for many years, but I always had this kind of feeling that sooner or later I was going to retire and become a history teacher. I'm just absolutely fascinated with history, reading history. To me, history is the study of human nature, which is endlessly fascinating. And so in the year 2010, so we're going back now 16 years ago, I was living and working in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I did one of the things I do when I had free time, is I went to visit a bookstore to look at what history books had just come in into print. So I went in there, went off to the history section, and I came across this new book that had just been published, a book called A Lucky Child, written by somebody named Thomas Bergenthal. And it was the subtitle that caught my eye. I don't know if it's not, I guess the cursor doesn't work on that, but you can see the subtitle. It says, "A Memoir of Surviving Auschwitz as a Young Boy." And I thought to myself, a memoir of anybody surviving Auschwitz has got to be an incredible story. How a child could possibly have survived this experience has got to be even more interesting. So on nothing more than an impulse, just by looking at that cover, the bar for me to buy a history book is pretty darn low to begin with, so it didn't take a lot of convincing for me. So I bought that, and of course that picture of Tommy on the left there, that's taken shortly after he was liberated in the spring of 1945. It looks a little bit more somber than that happy-go-lucky picture I showed you a few slides ago. So I take this book home, I start reading it, and I learn the story I just related to a few minutes ago, how Tommy ends up in Auschwitz, takes part in the evacuation, he arrives in Sachsenhausen with frostbitten feet, has some of his toes amputated. Nansen just happens to walk into that same, there was actually 4 infirmaries, Revier 1, 2, 3, and 4. Nansen Tommy was in Revier number 3, and that's where Nansen's friend was in. And that's the only reason why he ever walked by his bed in the first place. So at that point in Tommy's story, he says, you know, this fellow Nansen, who saved my life, he kept a diary while he was a prisoner. And then Tom includes, again, on the bottom of page, a footnote on the bottom of page 177. And I don't know if you can read it from that distance, but it's simply a description of the diary that he's mentioned up in the text. It's from day to day, published by G.P. Putnam in 1949. Originally, of course, came out in Norwegian in 1947. And so I guess, you know, having been trained as an attorney, I always technically read the fine print. I always read the footnotes. So I read that footnote, and I made a mental note to myself to say, you know, I've never heard of this Nansen fellow, and I've never heard of this diary before, even though I've read a lot of books about the war. So maybe this would be kind of an interesting book to read. So when I finished Bergenthal's memoir, I went out to try to get my hands on a copy of this diary called From Day to Day. Now, having been published in 1949, you're not going to find that at your local Barnes & Noble, right? You're going to have to go where? On the internet. Everybody who's selling anything in today's world is listing it on the internet. So I do a search, and I've bought a lot of out-of-print books through the internet, so it's not something I haven't done before. And after searching high and low, I'm able to locate one single copy of this book for sale anywhere in the entire United States. I found 2 more copies for sale in Great Britain. I found another copy for sale in Australia. I found a 5th copy for sale in New Zealand. 5 in the whole world. That's all I could find. So I ended up buying one of those 5. I bought the one in New Zealand because it was in the best condition of the 5. The dust jacket was, you know, not as torn up, et cetera, et cetera. And coming from New Zealand by surface mail meant it was going to be like 8 weeks before it actually arrived in my mailbox, such that when it arrived, I'd actually forgotten I'd even ordered it. You know, I'd already kind of moved on to some other history book that I was reading. And so when I got it, and you can see it's a pretty hefty book, when I opened it up, I thought, well, you know, this is a long book, but the great thing about diaries is they're really kind of like chapter books. You know, every diary entry is a kind of a standalone chapter. Some of them the entries are only a paragraph long. Some of them are maybe 2 or 3 pages at most. So why don't I, since I'm already in the middle of reading some other big history book that I don't want to put down, why don't I just every night read one diary entry? I'll just kind of read it the way Nansen wrote it from day to day. And I did that for about a week or 10 days. And then one night I was getting into bed to read, because this is the only time I had any free time to myself to do any reading. And I thought, you know, this guy was in prison for 3.5 years. At the rate I'm going, this is going to be the longest book I ever read in my life. I hope I'm alive in 3.5 years to see how this thing ends. So why don't I just start reading 2 diary entries? I'll cut my reading time in half. And I did that for another week or 10 days. And then one night, I'd finished reading my 2 diary entries, and something was about to happen in the diary. Nansen was going to get in trouble, or his wife was going to come visit him. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I thought, I can't stop at 2. I'll have to start reading 3 diary entries so I can kind of see faster what's turning on. So I think you can see the slippery slope that I was sliding down. Within a few days after that, I put the other book away. I don't think I've ever gone back to it. I don't even remember what it was in this passage of time. And I was smitten by this book at this point. I mean, I just couldn't put it down. I was carrying it with me. Everywhere I went, I'd go to work. I'd been bringing it to work with me. I'd say to my secretary, Linda, listen, I'm working on a really important loan agreement this morning. You know, I need total concentration. No visitors, no phone calls. Just leave me alone so I can concentrate. And I go in my office, put my feet up on my desk, take this book out of my briefcase and just start reading it. And before I'd even finished it, this thought kept occurring to me. 2 thoughts actually came to me. One is, how can it be that no one else has seen fit to reprint this book since 1949? That's a passage of over 60 years at this point that I'm making this decision. But even more confounding to me was, how can there be only 5 copies of this book for sale anywhere in the globe? My one purchase, I've cornered 20% of the market. You know, if I had told everybody just in the front row of this auditorium here to go out and buy the book in the year 2010, you couldn't have done it. You would have run out before everybody got their hands on a copy. So I said to myself, damn it, I'm going to get this book back into print. I don't exactly know how somebody does that. I'm just a finance attorney working in Charlotte, but everybody publishes every day, so it can't be that difficult. So I made up my mind, and I made one really important decision at this point before I started, which was I had gotten so involved in this, of course. Now I was spending every free moment doing Google searches on Nansen, on Norway, on World War II, on concentration camps. I didn't know they had these stratified societies where some prisoners were treated better than other prisoners. And so as I learned all that, I thought, my gosh, if I'd only known this when I was reading Nansen's diary, everything in it would have made even more sense to me. So why don't I not only publish it, not only take the old copy and basically retype it, but rather edit it and annotate it to explain every person, place, and event that Nansen's mentioning in the diary. If you don't want to look at all that detail, just read Nansen's words. That's what I fell in love with. But if you want to know more, I've kind of laid it out for you. And so after 6 years of doing research and 6 years of many rejection letters, Vanderbilt University Press agreed to republish this new, I call it deluxe, fully annotated version of Nansen's diary. So in the time we have available to us this afternoon, what I'd like to do is kind of answer some of the basic questions, the who, what, why, where, when, about the diary. And hopefully you'll come away, if nothing else, with an appreciation for what a remarkable man Odd Nansen was. Because to me, he's one of those kind of unsung heroes of World War II. So let's get started talking about who was Odd Nansen. This is a family photograph of the Nansen family taken in the spring of 1902. They just finished building this house, and they were showing off their house and having a group photograph there. When I tell you that Odd Nansen was born in December 1901, I think you can pretty quickly deduce that he's the young baby in his mother's arms. You can also see from this photograph that he is the fourth child born to his parents. His mother's name was Eva Nansen. His father's name was Fridtjof Nansen. Both of his parents came from well-to-do families in Oslo. Both of his parents were very accomplished in their own rights. They were both very artistic, and Nansen inherited that artistic gene. The cover of the diary, which I showed you with my first or second slides, that was a sketch that Nansen drew while he was in prison. And we're going to see a few more of the sketches that he drew while he was a prisoner. Unfortunately for Nansen, his mother died when he was only 6 years old. She died of pneumonia. In those days, there was no antibiotics. Some people made it, some people didn't make it. And so Nansen was raised pretty much single-handedly by his father, Fridtjof Nansen. And although the name Fridtjof Nansen doesn't mean much in the United States, I saw no flicker of recognition on anybody's face when I mentioned Fridtjof Nansen. In Norway, and I'm serious here, in Norway, he's considered to be, if not the most famous person the country's ever produced, he's certainly one of the most famous persons the country's ever produced. He made his reputation, his world reputation, initially as a polar explorer. He formed and led an expedition to get to the North Pole. He didn't make it all the way to the North Pole. He had to turn back, but he broke the prior record by something like 200 miles, which was unheard of in those days. And what was equally unheard of is he brought everybody back alive. Most of these expeditions ended up in disaster with people dying of scurvy and hypothermia and everything else. He was in his 30s when Fridtjof Nansen did that. Then he parlayed that kind of his world fame to become something of a statesman. He helped Norway achieve its independence from Sweden. Norway was part of Sweden until 1905. And when Norway became independent in 1905, it was a peaceful, there was a lot of hard feelings, but they didn't go to war with each other. They were allowed to go separately. The Norwegians said, now we need a new king. You know, we like the form of constitutional monarchy, which is the form of government we've been living under. We just don't want the Swedish king to be our king. We want our own king. And so they identified a candidate in Denmark, Prince Carl. And they said, who can we send to Denmark to convince Prince Carl to give up his cushy life in the royal family there and become the king of our country? Well, they sent Fridtjof Nansen. And he must have done a very good job because he convinced this guy to become the king of Norway, took on the title Håkon VII. And then in his 50s, Fridtjof Nansen became a humanitarian. When World War I ended, the League of Nations hired him as the first High Commissioner for Refugees. And Fridtjof Nansen did such a good job for the League of Nations in a variety of humanitarian tasks that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922. So you've got, in one lifetime, this guy has been a polar explorer, a statesman, and a humanitarian. And this is in a country that has a population at the time of like 3.5 million people. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny country. So to have a father that famous is a blessing and a curse, because your name goes everywhere, but you're always known as, oh yeah, you're the son of the really famous Fridtjof Nansen. Like, what can you do to like top what this guy has done? Nothing. There's no way you can do this. So just to kind of go over the highlights of Nansen's some facts. I say, born in 1901, 1927, he graduates from college with a degree in architecture because he's very artistic. He immediately marries his sweetheart, a woman named Kari Hirsch. Some people assume because her name was Hirsch that she was Jewish. She was not. There were very, very few Jewish people living in Norway at the time. And as soon as he gets married, and as soon as he's got his diploma, he announces, I'm leaving Norway. I'm moving to the United States. I'm going to get a job in Manhattan, live in Brooklyn. And I think more than anything else, he just wanted to get out from under his father's shadow. I mean, he wanted to go to a place where he was either going to make it or not make it on the basis of his own merits, not because his name was Nansen, because most people in New York wouldn't know what the Nansen name meant, just like most people here don't know much. So he works as an architect with an architectural firm in New York City for 3 years. Very successful, enters a contest among architects, comes in third place out of 150 entries. Then he gets word that his father Fridtjof is ill. This is 1930 now. Fridtjof has got some kind of heart ailment. In those days, there were no prescriptions for heart problems. There were no surgical procedures. You just had bed rest. And Nansen is on bed rest, but he's not getting better. He's getting, in fact, weaker with each passing day. So Nansen takes his family. They go back to Norway. They arrive in time to say their goodbyes to Fridtjof Nansen, who passes away in May of 1930, at which point Nansen announces that, hey, I'm not going back to the United States. I'm going to stay here, live here in Norway now. And I think it's because, you know, having his father, the man who would suck all the oxygen out of every room that he enters, is not there. He doesn't have to compete with his father. And I think if we could go back in a time machine to the year 1930 and interview Odd Nansen at the time and ask him, well, Mr. Nansen, now that you're back in Norway, you know, how do you see your prospects here? Well, how do you see your future? I think he would have said something along the lines of, well, gosh, I mean, everything looks rosy to me, the future. I've had some great work experience in the United States. I'm going to start my own architectural firm, which he ended up doing. I had my first child in the United States. I want to have more children, grow my family, which he ended up doing. I'm living in that house that my father built, this big mansion called Polheigda, which means Polar Heights. I'm back living with all my old classmates, all my old neighbors. Everything looks great. You know, the world, life is good, as that saying goes. Of course, we know the storm clouds are already beginning to form over Europe. January 1933, Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany, almost immediately starts persecuting the Jews. Many of them flee to Austria. Germany annexes Austria the spring of 1938. Many of them then flee on to Czechoslovakia. In fact, young Tommy's parents were in Germany until 1933, fled Germany to Czechoslovakia, which is where they met each other and then married and then had Tommy. He was born in Czechoslovakia. And there was a refugee crisis in Central Europe at the time because many of these, in fact, almost all the Jewish refugees, had no ability to cross national boundaries because they had no valid passports. Under the Nuremberg laws, they'd been denaturalized. They're not even citizens of Germany, so they're not entitled to a passport. So a number of prominent Norwegians put their heads together and tried to decide what are we going to do about this refugee crisis in Europe. And they come to one conclusion. The man we need to help work on this is Odd Nansen, because his name was Nansen. He's got more recognition than almost anybody else does at this point. So Nansen was being asked literally to kind of put his career on hold, put his family on hold, and undertake a really thankless task because the Norwegian government was anti-Semitic at the time, as were the Western governments, Great Britain, France. The United States State Department was very anti-Semitic at the time, not willing to change any of their laws or regulations to allow more Jewish immigration into the country. So Nansen has kind of an uphill battle, but by the time the war breaks out in September 1939, Nansen is able to bring about 300 men, women, and children into Norway on special visas. Then the war breaks out, so he has to close down Nansen, which was the organization, this NGO that he had formed to help these refugees. Fast forward, as I said, the war breaks out on September 1st when Germany invades Poland. Fast forward another year or so, Germany invades Norway without so much as a declaration of war. They invaded Norway in order to prevent the British from taking over Norway. The Germans were definitely afraid that the British were going to occupy Norway, and if they did that, they'd be able to blockade Germany. And Germany was highly reliant on iron ore exports from Sweden. And if Great Britain controlled Norway, they'd be able to block all these imports of iron ore, which would hurt the war effort. So they invade Norway, and fast forward almost another 2 years to January 1942, and Nansen ends up getting arrested and put first in a prison and then in a concentration camp. So before we talk about why Nansen was arrested, just to kind of sum up what we know about Odd Nansen. We know that he's famous. He's got the Nansen name. Even today in Norway, if you stopped anybody on the street and said, what does the name Nansen mean? They would know exactly who you're talking about. He's educated. He's got a college degree at a time when not many people went to college in the 1920s. He's artistic. We've seen one of his sketches on the cover of the book. As I say, I'll show you some more sketches that he drew while he was in prison. He's a humanitarian. He's like his father, the Nobel Prize winner, he's working on Nansen, which was really kind of, nobody else was willing to do it. And Nansen also had a pretty wicked sense of humor. And that shows up occasionally in his diary. And I know it sounds a little bit almost, I'd call it oxymoronic to be talking about humor when we're talking about life in a concentration camp. But I think Nansen used humor as a coping mechanism, as a way of coping with the horrors that he was experiencing. Some of you out there may be familiar with a man named Viktor Frankl. He wrote a book after the war. He was a Holocaust survivor who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, Frankl says, humor was one of the soul's weapons in the fight for self-preservation. So let me give you a couple of examples of Nansen's humor. This first one is from Friday, January 16th, 1942. So it's only 3 days after he was arrested on January 13th. And I guess in some ways this example may be more technically described as wit. Nansen had a very, very subtle wit. And if you read his diary almost too quickly, too matter-of-factly, sometimes I think you're going to miss the little barb in the message that he's writing. So he writes, he's talking about getting their prison uniform. He writes, trousers and jacket, a shirt and a pair of boots were issued to us today by Henning Botker, who was in charge of the wardrobe. The jacket, the shirt, and the trousers are too small for me and the boots unwearable. Everything else is all right. Or there's another one, this is one of my favorites. This is from June 8th, 1944. And at this point, Nansen is talking about the work squad that he's been assigned to. And they called their work squads commandos. That was the word that was used. So there was the automobile repair commando, the carpentry commando. And so Nansen writes in his diary, he says, the Unterscharführer in this commando, and a Unterscharführer would be the equivalent of a sergeant, who shares my cubicle all day, thinks exclusively and all the time about girls and unfaithfulness. Last night, one of his wenches wrote on his cigarette case the words, I love you, but in English. He had no idea what they meant, so he asked me this morning. I told him they meant, kiss my arse. His jaw dropped notably, and I let it drop. So, why was Nansen arrested, as I say, on January 13th? Well, if you back up about 2.5 weeks to late December 1941, you have December 26th, which in Great Britain is called Boxing Day, the day after Christmas. And on Boxing Day, the British launched a series of sabotage raids against the coastline of Norway. These highly trained special forces, they land on the coast. They quickly blow up a number of factories that the Germans are using for their war effort. Within 24 to 48 hours, they're back on their ships, they're heading back to England. And this drove the German overlord of Norway, a man named Joseph Terboven, furious that the British could pull this off and get away with it. And since he was the civilian head of Norway, Hitler's personal representative, he had no military power, so he couldn't order kind of a tit-for-tat strike. So he said, what can I do to prevent the British from doing this again? Because it's such an embarrassment to me that they were able to pull this off. And I have to, explain this or answer to Hitler for this. And he says, he finally said, I came up with a solution. What I'm going to do is I'm going to arrest 20 of the most prominent Norwegians and just hold them as hostages, okay? And of course, the value of a hostage is directly proportional to how prominent they are. So whose name do you think was on that list of 20 people? Nansen, okay, the son of Fridtjof Nansen. So he gets picked up and he's told, we're not accusing you of a crime. He was in the resistance, but the Germans didn't know that. It's just essentially, you're a hostage. You're our insurance policy, our bargaining chip now, and we're just going to hold you in prison for as long as we feel like it. So that's why he's picked up on the evening of the 13th of January. So why did Nansen write a diary? Writing a diary is an extremely dangerous proposition inside of a concentration camp. If you're telling really actually describing what's going on, because of course it's such an indictment of what the Germans are up to. So why would Nansen do that? Well, part of it was, I think Nansen had been keeping a journal, a diary, ever since he was a teenager. I've become very close to the Nansen family. They've shown me some of his early journals with all sorts of scribbles and drawings in the margins, things he would do in high school. So I think it was kind of part of his DNA to keep writing this. And he says in the foreword to the book, when he finally did publish it after the war, he says, I never wrote this diary with the expectation I was going to publish it. It never even dawned on me to think about doing that. He says, I did it for two reasons. He said, the first reason why I wrote the diary was for myself. And he says, writing the diary, and this is a quote, writing the diary was like confiding in a close friend and relieving my mind of all that weighed on it. It became a private manner of forgetting. So I think if he wrote things down, he could kind of put it out of his mind. I think the best analogy I can come up with is when you're putting together like a grocery list, when you write down what you're going to buy, you don't keep thinking over and over again, what am I going to do? You just know it's written down somewhere. You can kind of put it out of your mind. Of course, will be to you if you forget your grocery list once you get to the store. Now you have to kind of remember, what did I put on it? Was it bread or butter and whatever? So that was the first reason. He said the second reason why I wrote the diary was for my wife, Kati. I wanted her to know what was really going on in the camp, what was going on in my existence. Now, he could send her what I would call official letters that he would write and then give to the camp authorities. They would deliver it to his wife. She could respond. She could write letters to care of the prisons that he was in, and they would deliver it. But every letter going in and out of these camps was being censored by the Germans. I mean, they were reading everything. They made no bones about it. They didn't want to make sure these people weren't conspiring to do something or bad-mouthing the Germans, whatever it might be. So if you know the Germans are going to read it, what can you really write in a situation like that? Now, occasionally, when Nansen was first arrested, he was kept in a prison just outside of Oslo called Grini, which is still a maximum security prison in Norway to this day. Then he was sent to a work camp above the Arctic Circle. Then it got too cold and too dark up there, so they sent him back to Grini. Then he got in trouble with the commandant. It was a practical joke that went kind of haywire. It takes too long to explain it. But anyways, as punishment, the commandant summoned Nansen to his office and said, as punishment, I'm going to send you to a real concentration camp now, a camp called Sachsenhausen. And I'd advise you to tell your family to put up a headstone for you now. Okay? You're not going to come back from this experience. So he sent off to Sachsenhausen. So while Nansen was in Norway, in Grini outside of Oslo, his wife, Kati, could sometimes get special permission to come visit him. And this is his sketch of what he calls the family visit. Now you can see he's separated by a barrier. He can't touch his wife. There's no touching. The meetings were limited to 10 or 15 minutes. That's all you could meet up with. But as you can see, there's a guard standing as close as his own spouse is, listening to everything they're saying to each other. And of course, they had to be fluent in Norwegian, and you know that they're going to report everything they heard to their superiors. So again, under these, what are you reduced to? Basically, how are the children? Good. How's your health? Things like that. So the diary became his way of writing, explaining what was really going on in the camp. And many of his diary entries begin with the words, "Dear Connie, listen to what happened today. I've got to write this down while the memory's still fresh." And many of his diary entries end with the words, "Good night, Connie." You know, in his mind, he's talking to her. He's kind of unloading everything that's on his mind at the end of each day. So let me share with you a couple of diary entries that he writes about his wife. This first one is written on Saturday, May 23rd, 1942. And when Nansen was writing this particular diary entry, he was in solitary confinement. He was being punished by the Germans because they caught him writing a poem, which they thought was anti-German, because the title of the poem was Freedom. So he writes, "I wonder where Cotty is today. Is she sitting alone too? She may be unhappy for my sake. She must have heard by now that I'm inside." He puts it in quotation marks, meaning he's in solitary. "But dear Cotty, soon all these horrors will be over, and we shall live together again and be happy. I can't do anything without you, not even be in prison." Now, when he writes those hopeful words, soon will be over, these horrors will be over, soon we'll be back together again, he's been in prison for 4 months. What he doesn't know, but we know in retrospect, is it's going to take another 35 months before he's finally reunited with his wife. So compare the hopeful tone of that diary entry with one that he writes 2 years later, in the summer of 1944, August 27th to be exact, which happens to be the day of their wedding anniversary. And he writes, "Today's our wedding day. 17 years. The third wedding day in prison. So in a way that only makes 14. But 14 bright, rich years that have made it possible for me to get through these 3 dark ones. Life has been good to us after all. The wealth it has given us these 17 years no one can take from us. It is of eternity and will never die, even though we should never meet again." So you can see he's beginning to contemplate he just may never get out of this camp alive. The war just seems to go on and on and on. He thought the war was going to end in 42. Then he was certain it was going to end in 43. Here it is, June of 1944, and August of 1944, rather. And the war is raging with ever-increasing intensity with no end in sight. And the longer you spend in a concentration camp, the greater the chances of something bad happening to you. You catch an infectious disease which runs rampant in these camps. A guard takes a dislike to you and shoots you. He wouldn't even have to explain it. Wouldn't have to justify what he did. So those are the 2 reasons that Nansen states in his foreword as the impetus for writing the diary. But I think, having read this diary and reread it now multiple times, I think there was a third motivation. And it may not have been the initial motivation to start writing this diary, but it was a motivation to keep writing it even though he was becoming more and more aware of how dangerous this thing was. I mean, realized that if he got caught with it, he'd probably be executed. A Dutch prisoner is caught with a diary and is hauled away and no one ever sees him alive again. And I think what Nansen was realizing was that through a diary, by writing down what was happening just on a day-to-day basis, from day to day, he was basically bearing witness to the Holocaust as it was unfolding in real time. And he writes, in one of his diary entries, he says, "I'm not sure people will even believe what I'm writing. The things I'm describing here are so ghastly that it's almost beyond comprehension." But I think that made him even more motivated to say, I witnessed this. Not I remember what happened 5 years ago. I wrote it down the day it happened, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts. No one can deny what I went through. So I think that became his third reason why he was doing this. And I think Nansen realized he could use not only his words of the diary to explain what's going on, but he could use his illustration, his power of the pen, his drawing. And here's one of the other sketches that he drew while he was in prison. And I know you cannot possibly read it from the distance you're in, but he signed it on the bottom. On the right-hand side, it says Sachsenhausen, November 1944. On the left-hand side, the word is An Muselmann. An Muselmann is a Norwegian word that in English means Muslim. And for reasons that no one's quite sure of even to this day, in almost all the concentration camps in Germany, the people who were the most afflicted, the people whose life expectancy could be measured in weeks, if not days, if not hours, were called Muselmen. That was kind of a sign that you were consigned, that you didn't have much longer to live. You had one foot in the grave at this point. And of course, who made up the majority of the Muselmen in these camps? It was the Jews. The Jews had the worst of everything. Now, they weren't the only groups that were brutalized by the Germans. The Poles, the Russians, and interestingly enough, particularly the Ukrainians, were all brutalized by the Germans as well. But as Elie Wiesel reminds us, although not all victims were Jews, all Jews were victims. And that's a distinction I think we always have to keep in mind. They always had the worst of everything. And Nansen, I think, realized that he was, as I say, a witness to all of this stuff. And I think he realized that he could use his diary to kind of tell the stories of many of these Jewish prisoners that he was meeting. Most of the non-Jewish prisoners in these camps treated the Jewish prisoners as pariahs. People you want to stay as far away from as possible, because nothing good can happen to you from associating with a Jewish prisoner. You want to get caught up in a random beating when every other Jewish prisoner is getting a beating, well then hang out with them. But most people would say, just for sheer self-preservation, I'm going to steer clear of them as much as possible. But Nansen would actually go to the Jewish barracks. He would meet with the prisoners and ask them questions. Tell me, what camps were you in before you arrived here in Sachsenhausen? What were those camps like? What were the conditions there? What did you do before the war? Tell me about your family. And many of these Jewish prisoners would say to him, we know the score. We know the Germans are never going to let us live, no matter how this war ends, good or bad for them. So somebody has to tell our stories for us, because there's not going to be any of us around to tell them. And so Nansen uses the diary to tell these stories of these people that he meets. He talks about meeting and befriending a Jewish builder from Budapest who's captured in Yugoslavia and marched from Yugoslavia all the way to Sachsenhausen. It's a distance of 500 miles. Starts out with a column of 3,000 able-bodied men. At the end, 850 actually walk into the camp alive. And this is what Nansen writes about this Jewish builder in one of his diary entries. He writes, there's one touch, and this is from December 18th, 1944. He writes, there's one touching detail I must relate about this man. I've given him a few clothes and some cigarettes and some food. He was very anxious to show his gratitude. One day he came to me with a little thing that he wanted to give me as a souvenir, and I had to promise to keep it. It was, he said, the very best thing he owned. He had nothing else. It was one of the cigarettes that he had borrowed from me, now neatly covered in silver paper. I had given him only 3 cigarettes that time. I was in rather low water myself. After the war, he added, he would give me the same present in gold and precious stones. Now, why would somebody make such an extravagant offer? Gold and precious stones? I mean, I'm sure this man was grateful for the food Nansen was giving him, the clothing. Personally, I tend to think the reason why this man was going overboard was to show his gratitude for something that may have been, in fact, more valuable to him than even food and clothing. And that was the gift of empathy, the gift of friendship, the gift of just listening to somebody else. I mean, every other prisoner would normally say, look, don't tell me your sob story. I got enough problems of my own trying to survive in a concentration camp. I don't need to hear your belly aching about how hard it is. But Nansen wasn't like that. He was outer directed. So finally, how did Nansen manage to both create and preserve, over the span of 3.5 years, a diary? Well, Nansen said he had 3 challenges he had to overcome. Challenge number 1, actually writing the pages of the diary. Well, Nansen was one of these people, apparently much like his own father, Fridtjof Nansen, who had this incredible ability to operate on virtually no sleep. So whereas almost all the other prisoners who'd be exhausted, sound asleep by 9 or 10 o'clock at night in the barracks, Nansen would stay up till 11, 12, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, writing the diary, go to bed at 2 o'clock and get up at 4:30 and go back to work. So he was using this time when he carved it out, that no one else was around and it was dark. And he would usually have a candle to light what he was doing. So he said then the second challenge was hiding the pages of the diary once I wrote them, because God forbid if the Germans found them. He says, I solved that by putting it in the one place and knew the Germans would never go looking for it. And you want to guess? In the latrine. They weren't going into the latrine. So the Germans were germaphobes. They were deathly afraid of catching all these infectious diseases, typhoid fever, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. So they weren't going into that. So then the real issue was getting the pages of the diary out of the camp. Well, as I mentioned, for about 18 months of Nansen's incarceration, he's in a camp in Norway, Grini. You stop and think about it, who's delivering all the food into the camp, which they had to do on a daily basis. They didn't have refrigeration like the way we have it today. You got to bring in all your fish pretty much on a fresh basis. It's fellow Norwegians. As the Germans kept arresting more and more Norwegians and throwing them into these different camps that they had sprinkled all over Norway, they had to keep building more and more barracks. So who's delivering all the building supplies? Norwegian civilians. Things break down, electrical problems. Who do you call in to repair it? Norwegian civilians. Well, the people who are walking in and out of the camp are the neighbors, in-laws, bowling partners, friends, neighbors of all the prisoners. And so everybody was motivated to help these prisoners smuggle messages out. And the Germans used all sorts of ingenious ways of hiding what they were smuggling out. They would have a false bottom in a matchbook. They would have a hollowed out crate. When they bring in the fish, part of the crate would actually be hollowed out where they could slip in some messages going in and out. False bottoms in their heels of their boots. Little cavity where they could hide something. On one of my research trips, the Nansen family showed me a letter that Nansen wrote on a strip of paper that's only 1 inch wide and like 12 or 13 inches long that he rolled up into a cigarette. In those days, you rolled loose tobacco for cigarettes. You didn't buy cigarette packs. So that's how, somebody came along and said, hey, Nansen, you got a smoke for me? Yeah, here, take this cigarette. Handed it to him full well. He was going to light it up. He was going to bring it back and give it to his wife. So then Nansen gets sent to Sachsenhausen, and he writes in the diary, he says, I don't know how I'm ever going to get the diary out of Sachsenhausen. I mean, there's nobody on the outside who's willing to really risk their life to help me. I'm in the middle of an enemy country at this point. But for the reasons I've explained before, how psychologically it was important for Nansen, he says, I'm just going to keep writing. It's so helpful to me. Even if I can't think of an end game, I'm just going to keep writing this diary. And if I can't figure out some way to take this with me whenever I get out of the camp, assuming I'm alive to get out of the camp, which is, kind of a 50-50 proposition, I will bury it in the ground rather than destroy it, presumably with the idea that he'd come back after the war, try to exhume it and do whatever he's going to do with it at that point and show it to his wife or whatever. So that was his Nansen's game plan. And diaries have been found buried in the ground at different concentration camps, primarily in Auschwitz. For a while there, every decade, somebody would unearth another journal that was buried somewhere on the grounds of that sprawling camp. So Nansen finally says, but one day I had a brainstorm. And I realized that when I and all my fellow prisoners left the camp in the morning to go to our work sites, Sachsenhausen essentially all it was barracks behind a barbed wire. There was no room for them to do any work. So if you wanted to go to your work commandos, you had to go outside the gates to all these different sites, which are all within walking distance. He says, I realized when we left the camp, we were searched, and when we came back into the camp, we were all searched. And it became apparent over time that what the Germans were searching us for were weapons. They were deathly afraid of prisoners getting their hands on weapons, guns, knives, explosives, smuggling them into the camp, stockpiling them until they had a critical mass, then staging an uprising. And there was an uprising in Auschwitz in November 1944. There was an uprising in Treblinka. There was an uprising in Sobibor. So this was something that was a very real danger. And when you're a guard and you're outnumbered 100 to 1, it doesn't take too much by way of weapons to kind of even the score there. So that's what the Germans were focused on. So Nansen says, the one thing I realized that they didn't pay a whole lot of attention to were the two things that we prisoners, if we could get our hands on, we would hold on to them for dear life because they would make our lives just slightly better. The first thing a prisoner would try to get their hands on was a tin cup. Because if you had a tin cup, any chance you had to drink something, you'd have a tin cup to do it with. And so they carry it with them by tying it around their waist with a string. So it was always with them everywhere they were going. The other thing, if a prisoner can get their hands on, was a piece of wood, roughly about this size, what they called a breadboard, something that measured usually 3 to 4 inches wide, 6 or 7 inches long. In the morning, you'd line up in your barracks. In the head of your barracks, the block altester, the block chief, one of his jobs was to dole out your daily bread ration. You'd line up, hold this out, you'd get a third of a loaf, quarter of a loaf of black bread. What you did with it after that, it was up to you. This became kind of your private work service. Now, there were tables in these barracks, but by the spring of 1945, these barracks, which were designed to hold 200 prisoners, generally were holding 500 prisoners. So the chances that you were ever going to sit at a table and eat were very slim. So this was kind of an all-purpose surface, kind of your little personal work surface. Because it doesn't look very threatening to a German soldier, they didn't particularly care whether prisoners walked around with this. And Nansen says, so I realized I could take my breadboard, go to one of my friends who worked in the carpentry commando, who had access to some woodworking tools, and split my breadboard open lengthwise, hollow out the inside of it, and I'd put the pages of the diary in the breadboard, glue it together. No one would be any worse for the wiser. So at the end of the war, Nansen and 5 of his closest friends walk out of the camp with their breadboards. Germans didn't even give it a second thought. And in those 6 breadboards were the whole German duration of Nansen's diary. And this is what a real breadboard looks like. This is not Nansen's. Nansen's is part of their World War II display in their World War II museum in Oslo. This was one of his other friends. But as you can see from that image there, the paper he was writing on was ultra thin tissue paper. Now people often ask, well, how did Nansen get his hands on paper? How could he write a diary? I remind them, Nansen had what? Food. People would be more than willing to steal this, or whatever he needed to get food. That was the easiest thing in the world. So it's ultra thin paper that he was writing on, so you can put a lot of pages in a very small cavity. You can also see it's a little bit hard from looking at that image, but those two sample pages, there's not a single word crossed out. Nansen knew exactly what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. He never went back and backtracked and clarified anything. He just kept writing and writing. So that's how Nansen was able to get his diary out of the camp. So we've talked about who Nansen was. We talked about why he was arrested. We talked about why he wrote the diary and how he preserved it. In the course of that, we've talked a little bit about his sense of humor. We talked a little bit about his care for his wife, Kari, how he was motivated to write this diary for her. Talked a little bit about his empathy for the plight of the Jews, how he was using his food to help some of them. And I'll admit, this diary has its share of horrors. I mean, it's a pretty graphic tale of what was going on. But to me, what really motivated me, I think in retrospect, to spend 6 years of my life trying to get this thing back into print was just the power of Nansen's example. The example of somebody who somehow is able to hold on to his humanity in the most inhumane conditions mankind has ever conceived of. Nansen could have walked right by Tommy in the Riviera, could have easily have ignored him. Every other person had ignored Tommy up to that point. He could have rationalized, why should I get involved with this child? The chances of him surviving to the end of the war are practically nil. He's badly injured, recovering from major surgery, has no parents, he has no friends, and he's Jewish. I mean, what are his chances? But Nansen didn't walk by him. He got involved. And since I began my story this afternoon, telling you the story of Tommy, how Tommy ends up in Sachsenhausen, let me kind of complete the circle, come 360, and tell you what ultimately became of Tom. So he survived to the end of the war. He was in Sachsenhausen when he was liberated in late April 1945. His mother survived in a women's concentration camp in Germany, a camp called Ravensbrück. His father didn't make it. His father died of pneumonia in January 1945 in a subcamp of Buchenwald called Ohrdruf. And it would take Tommy and his mother a year and a half to find each other in war-torn Europe. I mean, Europe was just an absolute disaster at this point. Nobody knows where anybody is, no communication, no telephones, no search, people looking out. It was just people wandering around Europe trying to make a connection. But they ultimately do reunite in December 1946. And you have to remember, at least until Tommy was liberated in the spring of 1945, he's completely illiterate. Now think about this. He's never been in a school classroom in his entire life. He's been a prisoner of the Nazis since he was 5 years old. And at one point, Nansen writes in the diary, he says, I asked Tommy, well, why don't your parents teach you how to read and write? You don't have to go to school necessarily to learn your letters. And Tommy very patiently explains to Nansen that in the Kielce ghetto, where he lived with his mother and father for about 2 years, at the beginning of the war, it was a capital crime for Jewish parents to teach their children how to read and write. They could have been shot just for doing that. So Tommy is complete tabula rasa. He's got no education at all. So when Tommy is reunited with his mother in 1946, she takes him back to Germany, which is where she had grown up, to raise him. She hires a tutor. She says to the tutor, I want you to teach my son in 12 months everything he should have learned in grades 1 through 7. Okay? Talk about accelerated learning, right? So at the end of that 12-month tutoring, I can put him in the 8th grade, which is the grade that, based on his age, he should have been in if he had been going to school like a normal German child. So Tommy has 12 months of 1 year of tutoring. Then he enters the 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, starts the 11th grade. He's on the verge of being a teenager. He's starting to think about his own life, what he wants to do with his future. And the one thing he's certain of is he does not want to spend the rest of his life in Germany, for reasons I think that are pretty clear. So he has an aunt and uncle who live in Paterson, New Jersey. So he decides to emigrate to the United States. He arrives in New Jersey in December 1951. So think about this. He's arriving in a country he's never seen before. He's arriving to live with an aunt and uncle he's never met before. He's had 3.5 years of any formal education at this point. He's had only 3.5 years of any English instruction. Tommy didn't speak English. He only spoke German and Polish up till the end of the war. And he's arriving in the middle of the academic year at a junior level in high school, okay? So he finishes high school. He gets a scholarship to go to a small liberal arts college in West Virginia called Bethany College. 4 years later, Tom graduates as the valedictorian of his class. He then gets a scholarship to go to NYU Law School. He gets a legal degree. From there, he goes to Harvard Law School. He gets a master's degree and a doctorate in the field of international law and human rights, a field he says he was motivated to study based on the example of Odd Nansen. And Tom Bergenthal goes on to win every accolade, every award, every recognition in the field of human rights that you can think of. And that career culminated in the year 2000 when Tom Bergenthal was appointed to the International Court of Justice. That's a picture of Tommy in his judicial robes. One of the most unexpected benefits of my decision to get this book back into print is in the process of this, I became a very close friend of Tom Bergenthal's. Absolutely one of the most wonderful men I've ever met in my life. Unfortunately, he passed away 3 years ago now from COVID in May of 2013. But when Nansen published this diary, 2023, that's what I meant, yes. When Nansen published this diary way back in 1947 in Norway, he included a dedication page. And in the dedication page, he dedicated the diary to all of his Norwegian friends who were murdered in the camps. And he lists all of them by their first names. And then he goes on to say, and you too, little Tommy, to your living memory, I dedicate this book. That's in 1947. Well, as a favor to me, Tom Bergenthal wrote the preface to this new hardcover edition. 70 years after that same book was dedicated to him as a young child. I mean, if you wrote a novel that had that in there, everybody would say, that's so far-fetched that, no one can possibly believe it. But that's what happened. So what I'd like to do is leave you with one final diary entry, which to me, in my mind at least, kind of pulls together the whole story, the whole spirit of this story. The date of this diary entry is March 5th, 1945. Nansen goes to visit Tommy. And when he visits him, he says, Tommy, I've got some really bad news for you. In fact, this is the toughest thing I've ever had to do in my 3.5 years as a prisoner. And that is, I've just been notified that all the Norwegian prisoners are going to be transported yet again to another concentration camp, a camp called Neuengamme, which was located outside of Hamburg. And I've thought of every possible way of taking you with me, but I can't think of any solution. I've even considered hiding you in a burlap sack and trying to smuggle you into the camp so I can continue to protect you. So you have to promise me, Tommy, that you'll write to me after the war is over and tell me how you made out. And apparently Tom's response was, yes, of course, that is, I consider that to be my duty. And Nansen is so struck by the fact that a 10-year-old boy is explaining to this middle-aged grown man about what his sense of duty is. And this is what Nansen writes about this in the diary. Now, as I'm reading this, just remember, when Nansen is writing this in the diary, he doesn't know the war is about to end in about 8 weeks. He's long since given up trying to predict when the war is going to end. It just seems to go on forever. He doesn't know whether he's going to continue to get food parcels from the Red Cross. By now, the Allies have control of the air over Germany. They're bombing anything that moves during the daylight hours. Nothing gets around. He doesn't get those food parcels. He's going to end up like a Muslim, like everybody else in these camps. He doesn't know whether this camp they're about to send him to, Neuengamme, is better or worse. When he arrives in Neuengamme, he writes in his diary, he says, if death stalked the streets in Sachsenhausen, it galloped in Neuengamme. And yet with all of that weighing on him, just listen to these words, just focus on these, how compassionate how eloquent they are, how compassionate, how hopeful, and knowing what we know about Tommy, how prophetic they turn out to be. And this is what he writes. Little Tommy, if only your fellow creatures thought a fraction as much about their duty to you as you do about yours to them, all your prospects would be brighter than they are today. Thank God you don't realize that. And may you never come to realize the abyss of vile injustice that has been done to you. May there be such a future in store for you that all this vile, this unintelligible cruelty will be expunged from your mind. May you discover that life is not like that. The world is not as it looked to you from the floor of the cattle car when you cried because you were so terribly cold. May you one day grasp and experience its richness and all the warmth and joy, all the beaming light that are reflected in those big eyes of yours, too shrewd for a child's, and which are a reminder and evidence of what you are meant to be. Thank you very much. Now, if I haven't put you to sleep, I hope you have some questions for me. So, questions, please. Pardon me?
When did Nansen die?
Nansen died in June of 1973. And fortunately, at the time, Tom Bergenthal was at an international human rights conference. I think it was in Finland at the time. And he had a direct flight home to New York. And he, at the last minute, he said, I changed my plans so I could fly through Norway. And I stopped in to see Nansen just before he died. And Nansen said, I'm so proud of what you've done with your life. It's just, I couldn't have imagined a better ending. And within days after that, Nansen passed away. He smoked unfiltered cigarettes. So he died of some kind of emphysema, lung cancer, something like that. He was about 73 years old. So that was one question. Other questions? Please. It's got to be something on your mind. So, yes, sir.
The comment I'm going to make right now.
Okay.
This was phenomenal. But
Thank
you. I generally, when I go to class, I take notes, and then it sinks in.
Uh-huh.
There has been so much information. I mean, it is incredible.
Thank you.
Information.
Thank you.
Now, has anybody ever contacted you at a national level? Because if you may, without getting too heavy into politics,
Yeah.
you are skirting politics here. You're right over it, right over the obvious. And
I was going to say something about the Nobel Prize, but I decided not to editorialize.
no, but the fact of the matter is, with all that's going on in the world right now,
People need to know about Odd Nansen. That's.
I'm saying you have just. It's here.
Mm-hmm, it is.
People, if this doesn't get out,
Mm-hmm. That's why I have spent.
You got it out. You got his story out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, your story needs to get out. I'm serious.
Well, thank you.
I'm dead serious.
Thank you.
I'm as a heart attack.
Okay. Well, if you've got
because people in this country don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
My dad fought the Nazis in World War II. So the bottom line is, people don't understand here, for the most part, what they have. The words that came out of your mouth are illustrate what most people don't have a clue.
Right.
They don't. That was my dad used to say. They haven't had a difficult day in their life.
I know. Well,
They
in
really
Nansen's
have.
postscript, he says it was worse than you have any idea. So,
It is.
yeah.
It is.
And he realized even his words couldn't accurately describe everything that he was
What was
saying.
the prank that he did?
Pardon me?
What was the prank that he did that got him sent to a concentration camp?
Well, it took me about a half an hour to explore it. So you have to read the book. You have to read the book.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, they made up like a false newspaper with that looked like a newspaper, nonsense, but it was all just on freehand, and they kind of made it was almost like a satirical articles on, and the Germans thought it was real. That it was somehow there was a printing press somewhere in the concentration camp, and since the articles talk about hidden guns, they were looking around. They brought in troops and then when they realized that nothing was like this, the commandant was so embarrassed that he had overreacted. Says, "Okay, Nansen, you're one of the leaders here. You're going off to Sachsenhausen." And that's when he says, "Tell your family you're never coming back." So, yes, sir.
Was the book written in English or
No, written in Norwegian. Written in Norwegian, published in 1947, translated by a woman named Catherine John. She was the daughter-in-law of a painter called Augustus John. You may have heard of him. He was a pretty famous painter. He's got his paintings in the Tate Gallery. And she was an expert in all Scandinavian languages. She translated Icelandic, Swedish, and every Norwegian I've ever spoken to says that her translation is a completely accurate picture of what Nansen wrote. I mean, she was excellent.
You say there were only 5 copies in existence. Were those English copies?
Yes,
So
yes.
they were Norwegian.
There are Norwegian. Now, the Norwegian version, when it was published back in 1947, I don't know if you saw the footnote, you probably couldn't read all the details, it was actually published in 3 volumes. It's even longer than what's here, so that when it was translated into English, it was also condensed. It's still pretty hefty, but that's not everything that he wrote. I mean, he was kind of one of these super industrious. He wanted to write down everything that he was experiencing at all times. Yes, sir.
How many times besides that one time, how many times did Tommy get to see?
Well, I think I don't know how many times, but they were close friends. So I should kind of ask a question and answer it. But the question people often ask is, did they ever meet up again after the war? Kind of open-ended. And so the story goes when when Tommy meets his mother in December 1946, he says, "Mutti, the reason why I'm alive today is because a Norwegian saved my life by bribing the orderlies in the hospital ward and got me through that. Unfortunately, I can't remember his name." Tommy he's lived by his wits essentially in post-war Germany, post-war Europe for 18 months. He's got a lot of other things on his mind plus he's illiterate. He wouldn't even know what Nansen's name looked like if he didn't, he saw it. So it seems like that's the end of the story. It's kind of a dead end until Tommy's mother reads in a refugee newspaper that a Norwegian has just published his diary in Norway, and his diary covers his incarceration in Sachsenhausen, and that diary is the #1 best-selling book in Norway in 1947. So she says, "Why don't you write to this man and ask him to help you find the person you're looking for?"
He might be.
Yeah, so he writes a letter. "Dear Mr. Nansen, I understand you've published a diary that you were in Sachsenhausen the same time I was in Sachsenhausen. In fact, you may be the man who saved my life. I was the young boy who had the toes amputated. And if it's not you, maybe you can put me in touch with the man who did save me so I can thank him." And this is all in Tommy's memoir, A Lucky Child. He says, I write this letter, I put it in an envelope, and I address the envelope, "Mr. Odd Nansen, Norway." That's all he's got.
But of course,
But the Norwegian, and of course, they know. This is the most famous Norwegian in the whole country. They know where he lives.
we'll find a place.
Exactly. So the letter, of course, gets to Nansen. So Tommy writes, weeks go by, he's kind of put it out of his mind, he's forgotten all about it. And he says, one day there's a knock on the door. They were living in a city in Germany called Göttingen. That's where Tommy's mother had grown up. It's a big university town. And it was part of the British occupation zone. And the British used Norwegian soldiers as part of their occupation force after the war. So there's a knock on the door. He goes to the door, and there's these Norwegian soldiers standing there. And they ask him, "Is this the Bergenthal residence?" "Yep, it is." "Well, we've got a package to deliver to you." "Oh, okay." So he says, takes a couple of these soldiers to take this gigantic wooden crate off the back of this military truck, lug it into their apartment, put it on the floor, take out a crowbar, they pry open the top, and Tom says, "I peer into this box, and it's filled with chocolates and sardines and cheese and all the food you cannot get in post-war Germany. It was under strict rationing." I'm not sure I'm going to be able to finish the sentence. And on top of it is a letter that begins in German, mein lieber Tommy, my dear, dear Tommy. Nansen flew down, he met Tommy's mother, took him back to live in Norway for the summer so he could swim in the fjord and get his strength back. And they did remain very, very close friends for the remainder of their lives.
Did you ever get the answer to why did I have O-N in my nose.
Yeah.
Why he stopped why he actually stopped? I mean, that's
Stopped what?
Why he actually went by. I mean, did he ever talk about that moment?
Oh, he says when he saw him?
Yeah.
He says, when I saw him in the infirmary with the pillow propped up behind him, he looked like one of Raphael's angels. And I think it reminded him of his own family.
Sure.
And it was Nansen. I mean, again, you could do all that and still walk on and say this,
Yeah.
but Nansen wasn't like that. And I think there was something in his heart that just stopped him, and he had the ability with the food parcels. So.
Did Nansen continue his humanitarian career after?
Yes, Nansen remained, at one point he was the special assistant to the director of UNESCO after the war, and he lobbied the director of UNESCO for more aid to Germany. He says, if we do not get Germany back on its feet after the war, all we're going to do is create another cycle of hate, and we're going to have another war in another generation. So he was a big proponent of that. He was also involved with the One Government, which was kind of like a quasi-United Nations. Let's get everybody to get together and hopefully negotiate as opposed to resorting to force. So he did those two things. I had some follow-on thought, but it's slipped my mind now. But thanks for asking that question.
Did he remain as an architect as well?
Yeah, he practiced as an architect. He had 4 children total, and 2 of them became architects in his firm. Now, when I met Tommy and met him for the first time and told him I was going to try to get the diary back into print, and at which point he said, you find a publisher, I'll write the preface to the book. And he says, I will write to Nansen's children and introduce you and urge them to cooperate with you. And it was Nansen's eldest child, Marit, the one who was actually born in Brooklyn, who was the family historian. And she had like a complete recall of everything that happened. I can ask her, Nansen says in the diary, I looked out, when he's on a ship being sent to the north above the Arctic Circle, I saw Joe and I told him to say hi to Sam. Well, who's Joe and who's Sam? Well, I said, Marit, who is this? Oh, Joe is his first cousin who lived in Trondheim, who had a leather store. I mean, she knew everything. She knew all the details. So, and we became so close friends. She came to America and stayed with me as my house guest several times. She was a wonderful lady, too. She passed on at age 92 about 3 years ago. But when she passed 90, her daughters called me up, and there's 2 more stories. Her daughters called me up and said, we're going to have a surprise birthday party for her. And we're going to have it on the deck of the Fram. The Fram is the ship that Fridtjof Nansen took to the North Pole, which is in this gigantic museum in Norway. We're going to have it there. We know it's probably too much for you to come, but we're just telling you about this. I said, no, I'm coming for this thing, okay? I'm telling you. They said, okay, we'll make it a surprise. I said, okay, great. Well, 2 days later, they call up and they say, we decided we're going to tell Marit because we're afraid if you just show up, she's going to have a heart attack. So, but when she passed away, I was in touch with her children. And one's named Kadi and the other one's named Anna. And I said, if there's anything of Marit's when you're wrapping up her estate and her house and all that stuff that you can part with, I would just like some kind of memento to remember her by, because she was such a wonderful woman and such a great help. And they said, yeah, well, we'd be happy to send you something. So weeks go by. They send me an email saying, Tim, look out for a package. It's on its way to you. Come home one day, big box in the kitchen, about this big. I open it up. It's all packing peanuts. Inside is another box. I open that up. More packing peanuts. It's like the Russian dolls kind of thing. Finally get to this small box, only about this big. I open it up. And inside of it was a hand-carved box that Nansen carved while he was in prison. And I said, what are you doing giving this to me? And they said, Tim, you're part of our family. I mean, they're just, the Nansens are just wonderful, wonderful people.